Yeah, so today I'll be talking about the effect of React on web standards. So what I'm going to be doing here is it's going to be a 45-minute talk down to 30 minutes because we only have 30 minutes left. So I'm going to try to, I'll race a little bit through it, but that's okay. Yeah, so I'm a Canadian and Austrian JavaScript developer, so I'm a freelance JavaScript engineer. I'm working on a variety of different things. I'm working on Node stuff, I'm working on React, I'm working on GraphQL stuff, yeah, just all sorts of different things. And I read a lot of Twitter, so you guys don't need to. And yeah, that's me. And yeah, so this is also a talk that was done at React Alicante, so if you guys want to see like the extended version that maybe I don't cover some of the things, you can see it on YouTube. Yeah, so what are we going to be covering today? We'll be covering so web standards, so the what, the who, and the why, so basically what web standards are, who is involved in web standards, and why. So why are web standards created? So the discontent with web standards. So over the years, there has been some people that are not so happy with the way that web standards are made. Maybe they're verbose, maybe they're hard to use, and so I'll be going over that kind of thing. And also the new approaches that people have come up with. Also React is one of these new approaches. So like the paradigms behind React. Some of the ideas, how they embrace standards. So the React team, they kind of dog food this stuff. They embrace like what is available in the platform, so that they can ship a smaller library. And I'll explain that. So who's involved in React, and also web standards. So who's involved in web standards and the proposals that they make. So the proposals that they make to change the way that JavaScript and HTML and CSS all works. Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about the future as well. So the integration efforts, so interoperability, things like that. The alternatives to the DOM, if there ever will be any, and new languages. So just kind of a disclaimer before we start, React, when I say React, we're not talking about the library, so we're not talking about the JavaScript library that Facebook creates. We're talking about so the paradigm, so to declaratively describe your UI, whether that be a web app, whether that be a native app, whether that be a command line thing, or anything else. There's even been like stuff like music, so React Music. It's also an ecosystem. So an ecosystem of it's basically like a rich community of people that come together and contribute to this, that make libraries for it, that make it really easy to use. And also the philosophy, so the philosophy behind it. So immutability, functional programming, a lot of these kinds of things. A lot of these things will be kind of repeated throughout, so don't worry about it if you don't get them all right away. So first of all, web standards. So what are web standards? So web standards, that's like an example of web standards, so DOM manipulation. So this is how you would manipulate the DOM if you're not using something like React or some kind of library. So you have to, it's very imperative and lots of boilerplate, and yeah, so it's not very nice to use. So another example, this keyword. So this is a very confusing thing about JavaScript. This. Yeah, so it's context based, and like, I mean, unless you're using arrow functions or something like that, then you have, yeah, then it's a different context. Anyway, it's complex. The video tag. So this is like an example of some kind of imperative thing where you're adding event listeners to if a video is going to be played or not. And so to add some callbacks to that, so what's going to happen in certain circumstances. So the problem with a lot of this stuff is that you have to kind of load the whole context of the program and every possible state into your head, and know about like what kind of transitions that it can make. And if you're debugging it, then you have to kind of go through all of these things in your head. It makes it a little bit tougher. So another example would be XML HTTP requests, so the thing that people call AJAX a lot, or fetch, I guess. Fetch is nicer, but yeah, so this is just basically making a request after a web page is loaded, so you can do fancy JavaScript stuff. But yeah, again, a lot of boilerplate, a lot of ceremony, and custom elements. So custom elements are kind of like, custom elements is one of the specifications that is behind web components. Web components is like the standards version of what React could be. So basically, like React provides this kind of paradigm, some way to better work with the DOM, and web components could be that, or it was thought of that it could offer this promise, but it's kind of difficult to work with, and it's very, very coupled with the DOM, which I'll get into later. So who makes it? So we were talking about what they are, I kind of went over that, and then who does it. So we have the W3 tag, so that's the technical advisory group. There's a lot of different groups. I didn't put them all up on here, but these are some of the most, some of the biggest ones and some of the most relevant ones to web developers, to front-end web developers. The TC39, so we'll be talking mostly about the TC39 actually, because that's like JavaScript stuff, and React is really heavily JavaScript. And yeah, some CSS things and some other community groups and things like that. So who are on these spec groups? And what you'll notice is like the people that are on these spec groups are from like big organizations, so they're from big companies. A lot of the time, there are some exceptions. There are some invited experts and some people that are not part of a big company, but a lot of the time it is this. Yeah, so this is basically like who makes the specifications, but we also have the implementers. So the implementers are an even smaller group of big companies. So these are the people that actually are the gatekeepers at the very end, who decide how is something actually going to get into the platform, is something going to actually be available to end users, so their end users are actually us, so developers. So are things going to be available? And so it's controlled by big company gatekeepers. Yeah, so how are web standards actually made? So this is basically like they're consensus based. So what you'll notice is there's a lot of different stakeholders. So there's a difference between web standards, the way the web standards are made, and the way that a library is made. So a library such as React, or some kind of something where you can have a monoculture, you can decide on stuff really quickly. You don't need to go through a whole bunch of different stakeholders, a whole bunch of different parties that need to agree on something. This has actually been a big problem in the past because, like for instance, there ES3, so this or was it called ES4? Yeah, ES4. Yeah, the non-existent version of ECMAScript. So the one that everyone thought was going to be the cool thing, like every new cool thing was going to be in ES4. Turned out that later it's going to come in ES6, and maybe you guys have played with some of the things like class syntax and like all of these new kind of features. But this was actually a long time ago already with ES4, and then Microsoft was blocking it. So basically, yeah, so stakeholders, there's a lot of different parties that are involved. Recommendations can be ignored, so these gatekeepers can say, hey, we don't want to do this, we're just not going to include it in our browser. We have a large market share, so it doesn't matter. And non-standard paths, so some non-standard paths were really cool. So like this XML HTTP request, so this AJAX thing, that was like a non-standard. That was Microsoft, and they just went off and they did their own thing. And it turned out to be a really cool thing, and it changed the web forever. But yeah, it's not cool when your browser doesn't have it, I guess. Yeah, and yeah, blocking stems. So this is what I was talking about ES4. Yeah, so this is kind of like, it's not all doom and gloom. So the browser makers are now they're working on this. They're basically saying, okay, we're going to try to work together, guys. We're going to try to play nice on the playground. Yeah, so this is kind of cool. But basically, what is to keep in mind throughout this whole thing is that web standards are fundamentally different. So they're not like libraries where they can just quickly iterate on things. So there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of legacy involved, and there's stuff that you can't just get rid of on the platform, because then you're breaking websites for people, and that's not good. Yeah, so we were looking at the what, so what web standards are. So how are people being discontented by it? I kind of described that a little bit. And what are the new approaches that they came up with, so that some developers decided to do. So the excessive boilerplate, we talked about that a little bit. So writing a lot of code basically to accomplish what we think is very little. So to mutate a DOM element or something like this seems to be a fairly simple thing to us now. Back then, maybe not, I'm not sure. Maybe that's why it was harder. So like incompatible or missing implementations in browsers, so if you don't have a particular feature, and insufficient components. So one example of this was when Ken Wheeler, so Ken Wheeler is one of the guys in the React community, and what he has a problem with not enough web components being available, so primitives being available. So we have a div, but why don't we have like a time picker, or why don't we have some better date picker that's like across the whole platform, that's available everywhere? Why don't we have more of these widget kind of things? So this was his idea there. And also like confusing or non-memorable syntax, so stuff that's just like, how do you do that again? Was it substring or subster, or like, yeah, all of these like weird kind of things and warts on the platform. And yeah, the kind of like the imperative kind of approach, this is like loading the whole program into your head and trying to go through all the steps linearly, as opposed to a declarative approach, or other kinds of functional paradigms, which we'll go through. So some new approaches was like jQuery. So this is kind of this is a nice improvement on the syntax. That's basically like doing AJAX, doing the XHTTP, XML HTTP request. So yeah, it's just a little bit less ceremony. They just took it down to a more data-driven approach. So just basically the very basics on what you need. Dojo was also a thing. It just made it easier to do DOM manipulation, among other things, of course. And yeah, what's really cool about these things is that some of these things actually came into the platform as well. So the document query selector all, this was influenced actually by jQuery. So this kind of influence is what we are seeing and will see, in my opinion, in the future from React as well. So React is proposing all of these kind of paradigms, and so this can make its way into the platform. It is kind of slowly making its way, but the big blocker is the DOM. We'll see that later why that is. So the CoffeeScript was also a thing for a while. So in 2009, this was kind of like this middle step in between. It was really cool. I wrote some CoffeeScript for a while. And it was nice. It had some cool things. And then like once ES6 came out, then yeah, everyone kind of dropped it. Well, not everybody, but yeah. And so, but some things kind of stuck around. So the arrow function, that was like basically from CoffeeScript. This class syntax has some similarities to the class syntax that we have today as well. Yeah, so it was actually like it had some influence on the standard as well. In 2009, we also had these new frameworks that came out. So Angular, we had Ember, Knockout, and what they introduced was this concept, or what they introduced to the web was this concept of data binding. So having your data declaratively in the position, so you have the user's location and their age directly in your template, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, in this case, it is a template. In React, it's not as much templates, but yeah, it's really all semantics anyway. But so this was the data binding approach. This was actually prior in the .NET presentation framework, Windows presentation framework, and so this kind of ideas are always like passed down and mixed around, and yeah, that's kind of interesting because that happens a lot in web standards as well. So there's cross-pollination between different things. We're looking at there's like an Ember example. So that was also a way to kind of bind and mutate the DOM in an easier way. So then in 2013, React came along. And so what React did was it took some existing paradigms and improved them, and then it introduced some new paradigms. So one of the paradigms that they improved was the data binding. So they took data binding how it was, and then they thought, why do I have to play around with all these implementation details? Why do I have to know about how data binding works in this framework? So why do I need to use scope in Angular to access this object? And why do I need to do other things in Ember so that things are updated properly? I can't remember the details, but there's some things that just make it more difficult to use, and you have to kind of know how it works. So in React, the data binding is a little bit more easy to use, and it's more transparent. So you just write it for how it's supposed to be updated, so declaratively, and then it's taken care of for you. So yeah, that's what Pete Hunt also mentioned in this talk. There's a number of talk things that you guys may be interested in, quotes and things like this. Also Twitter stuff. So the virtual DOM was another paradigm. So this was something that was introduced. So this is actually the reason behind the improvements in the data binding. So it's basically re-rendering without the performance hit. So it's the idea, they kind of described it as restful, actually. So you hit, it's kind of like hitting a PHP server or some kind of server all the time, and you get back a response. And so you just describe how this response is supposed to look. And that's what your website is going to look like. But it all happens in the browser without actually going out and touching a server. So you just describe how your template looks, and then it re-renders the whole thing more transparently to you. It does the updates that it needs to do. So another one was JSX. So this is basically like JavaScript instead of so you use JavaScript instead of using some kind of templating language. So instead of having to know the DSL syntax of a particular language, so ngbind or some kind of repeat syntax or something like this, you use JavaScript. So this brings you back to using standards, basically. So this is how one way how React actually embraces standards as well. also functions instead of strings. So that means that yeah, so the JSX is actually transpiled to function calls. So instead of having a string that is going to be parsed by some kind of parser and then transformed eventually into some kind of instruction set, then you're basically calling functions. You can actually write it in the functional syntax as well, so you don't need to write it with all of the angle things, angle brackets. You can write it in the other way as well. Another paradigm that React is very strong on is functional programming. So it has very, very strong roots in functional programming. The first version of React was actually prototyped in this SML, so it's simple or standard ML, which is yeah, it's a functional language, and yeah, the pragmatic functional approach. So basically, what they say also in their documentation is that they want people to get into functional programming who maybe don't know as much about functional programming. They don't want to beat you over the head with it, and for object-oriented people that haven't learned this way, they don't want to turn people off from it, so you kind of get escape hatches, you get ways to get out of it, but yeah, it's the pragmatic approach to it. Yeah, so that's how they highlight that in the docs. So basically developers with different skill levels. So the immutability and unidirectional data flow. So basically, what they're saying here that they want to restrict the amount of power that you have over it, so that you don't actually. It just makes it easier to reason about problems when you run into them in your program. And they're a component model, so it's reusable, composable, and testable, and decoupled from the DOM. So that means, like I was saying before, that you can also do it to native apps. You can do it to music, to whatever, basically. So it's basically like it's a paradigm that allows you to define different components, different parts of your program for whatever target you want. Also minimalism. So they do the low API surface. So basically, what they don't want to have a whole huge amount of API that you have to learn. So with Ember, you have every possible thing in there. And with React, it's just a little bit of a different approach, where they try to keep it as minimal as possible and to try to offload a lot of that onto JavaScript. And so they remove proprietary features for this, and so that it feels like you're actually just using JavaScript. So this goes into the embracing of web standards. So they build on the ubiquity of JavaScript. JavaScript is everywhere. JavaScript runs on so many different devices, and so they want to have you write standards-based JavaScript. So JavaScript that is using the new standards that are available, that are being proposed. So use polyfills instead of using other libraries for this, basically. And JavaScript is basically their intermediate format. So that means that they use this. So that means that if you were to want to switch to a different framework or something like that, you're writing most of your application in JavaScript still. So it's still, a lot of it is transferable. So Sebastian Marc Bourget, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He says that this is a great strategy to creating a better library. So just listen to the standards people. So listen to, because they have a lot of different constraints that you maybe you don't think of as much, and a lot of legacy and everything. So the thing is, they don't like everything of web standards. So how do they curate? So one thing that they say is, one thing that Sebastian also says is, so how can we actually remove stuff from language? It's a really hard thing to do, because you have this paradigm of don't break the web. You don't want to actually break the internet, so this is one of the things that you'll see in mailing lists. You'll see in a lot of really old things. You don't want to have it where you're breaking the internet for people, where people go to a website and it just doesn't work. So this is a paradigm. This is like a rule of browser makers. They don't want to have this broken, so they have to have like a certain amount of percentage before they can remove something from the platform. And so that means that web developers have to stop using it. And how do we get there? So that's the hard thing. So what kind of things do they have? What do they have problems with in standards? So again, it's the same thing. It's like the verbose APIs, imperative, no declarative DOM updates. So there's no API for saying, okay, this is what I want, and well, kind of like React. So this is what my template should look like, and you handle all the stuff, all the magic that happens behind the scenes to take care of it. But that's kind of why React exists. So also the tight coupling between the different components. So you have the tight coupling between DOM and CSS. So you can't. So I think Oleg was talking a little bit about the CSS model and doing these style sheets and everything. And this relies on the DOM. And so how do we get past that? How can we get away from the DOM, because the DOM has some problems that I'll be going through. And also the foundational quirks. So these are things like substring versus subster. Okay, so web components. So the web components were basically a list of different, so 4 different standards that came out. So we have Shadow DOM up there. We have HTML imports, custom elements, and templates. And so they come together and they make this kind of platform that is supposed to make it easier to work with custom functionality. So building blocks of components that have custom functionality. So there are advantages to it. So they have the Shadow DOM encapsulation, and it could potentially become kind of like an interoperable standard. And then if it did, then we're kind of like all writing to the same kind of standard. And that feels nice, that's good. The problem is, so there's no real kind of way to do them declaratively. Like I mentioned before, it's all based on the DOM, so you're all still having to do all of this imperative kind of mutation of things. And yeah, that's the imperative API. No focus on compatibility. So this is, composability. So that means that two different web components, if they want to communicate between each other, data flow between them, that's not so easy. So they need to have like event listeners, event handlers, and it's a lot of setup and it's a lot of boilerplate. And the people that make web components say, yeah, actually we didn't actually have a solution for this. So that's not what web components are for. But maybe they should have this as well. So maybe they should have these things. And yeah, it embraces the DOM. There are also no alternative render targets. So this was actually one of the first kind of questions that I had about web components when I heard about them. Is that, hey, can we do this? Can we do like server-side rendering on it? And it's not really. I mean, you can kind of run a browser on the server and then get the HTML back, but it's like, what? Then so the web standards proposals. So these are coming from these 3 lovely guys. So that's Sebastian again, Jeff Knoll, and Jordan Harvin. So yeah, he's from Airbnb. These guys are from Facebook. And so it goes through this kind of process. I'll try to run through it quickly because we're kind of low on time. Yeah, so basically, first of all, we're going through stage 0. So this is like you bring the idea to the committee, talk about it. People try to knock it down. The stage 1 is providing more information. So making use cases. You have some prerequisites like a champion. So a champion is someone that brings it to the next stages in the specification process. You need to have someone like that. Then you have stage 2 to make it more formal. You need to have like a precise description of the syntax and semantics. Stage 3 is when it's like a candidate already. So basically, you have the spec. It's already done. internally, so internally inside the organization, and then it needs to actually be implemented by browsers, and it needs to actually have implementations out in the wild to see, is this actually going to work? Then stage 4 is like, yeah, this works. We have 2 implementations in browsers. So yeah, 2 different browsers have done it, Safari and Firefox, for example, or Chrome and IE or Edge. Yeah, let's not say IE anymore. And then finally, it actually gets into the specification, so it gets in the written document. So my kind of I posit that React is that React contributors and the kind of paradigm and philosophy, they are working with the standards committees. They have the goals of bringing some paradigms, so some paradigms to the actual languages. So lowering the paradigms into the language. That's one thing that Cheng Lu says. So to add new low-level APIs to allow optimization. So this is basically like exposing the functionality that's already available in the web. That kind of like it goes to the extensible web philosophy, extensible web manifesto. The boilerplate reduction and tooling improvements that kind of come from like developer experience stuff, and maybe we can do stuff like make React obsolete. I mean, maybe that's a possibility. So that's kind of a dream of some people. So that would be great. So here's an example of one of the proposals. So this is also by Sebastian. So we have the REST property. So maybe you guys have already used this. Actually, this is a stage 3 proposal. So I think it's like almost in the direction of stage 4. There's an open issue on GitHub for that. I think this has been implemented into platforms already. It just needs to go a little bit further. Yeah. So basically, what you're doing here is you're in the first one, you're taking out the A and B into this object, and in the spread, the Z it's put back into the object, basically, in those 2 in the last positions there. Another one is actually this is just basically showing how it can be used with React. So this is one of the examples, or 2 of them from the React docs and the Redux docs. So this can be used in applications. So it can help out if you're trying to mutate state in a way. Yeah. So you have immutable state, or Redux says that you should do it all immutably. So how do we do that? And we basically we spread it into this object there. And there's another specification. So for the silent property accessors, so it's basically for it's less complicated for accessing data. So it's a way to allow for more declarativity. So basically, if you run into a problem, so if you run into some deep nesting and something doesn't exist in there, then you're going to actually like throw an error normally. This just returns back undefined. This is kind of similar to this other one, this optional chaining. So this is kind of like a competing specification. So this one's actually stage 1 though. So this is just from a couple of other guys, non-Facebook guys. Kind of same approach, just gives back undefined. Another one is that was just an example. Another one is the class fields. So this is something maybe you guys have already used as well. So you can do you can set properties, and you can set like static properties and also private properties. So the private thing came a little bit later. First of all, it was 2 different proposals. Now it's combined into one to rule them all. Yeah, so this is also like in the React documentation. So you can set basically like click handler here. We have the scoped constructor arguments, so this is just also a little bit of boilerplate reduction. So you have something where you can set these properties directly from the constructor arguments. Yeah, that's another different example. So this one does captured arguments. So pattern matching, this is another new one that has come out. So this is another kind of functional paradigm. So this is in different languages. So like Rust and F#, they have these kind of paradigms as well. So this is like some of the cross-pollination that I'm talking about. Do expressions, another functional kind of thing. Yeah, so this is how you could use do expressions in your application. So just a little bit of less stuff that you need to write. Object values, object entries. So being able to run through these the different parts of an object in using array kind of methods. And yeah, so immutable data structures. This was actually a proposal by Sebastian, but it was just presented. I think it was just like strawman, or maybe even before pre strawman. So yeah, just nothing, didn't go any further. There was some implementation problems with it, and also like shallow equal. So to see if an object is shallowly equal, so it won't do like the deep equality test if you have really nested data structures, but yeah, shallow. This one actually made it into ES 2017, so get on property descriptors. So it basically just helps with copying objects. And yeah, trailing commas. So this is about tooling and stuff like this. And yeah, that's how it helps. So why hasn't there been more progress? So the problem with this is browser vendors, they come along and they don't get actually like a lot of progress or a lot of change into the browsers very quickly, because they don't want to change the web. They don't want to break the web, like I was mentioning before, and they don't want to have the wrong abstraction. So the wrong abstraction is often worse than having no abstraction at all. So they don't want to go in a direction that people aren't going to like, kind of like the DOM. So yeah, I'll just go through this really quick. So yeah, you can't remove anything, and yeah, these are basically some of the things that I already mentioned. So this is the extensible web manifesto. So what we want to do is take the stuff that's already in browsers and just expose it. So the power that we already have. Some of the other influence that React has influenced Angular, right? React has influenced Ember, Polymer, Vue, and even web components. So web components, the web components team has actually been has actually taken some inspiration from React as well. So what does the future look like? Integration and interop. So on this level, and Andre Stoltz wrote an interesting blog post on this. So he said you could use it for the leaf. You could use web components for the leaf elements in your, so the divs kind of thing in your React application. Two libraries here that are so Skate.js and React elements. These kind of try to play together with web components. This is a fairly new thing that's happening, or it will happen. So this is basically something that Jason Miller, this develop it guy that he's tweeting there, he has something that's maybe in the works that's going to allow for transpilation in between frameworks, and maybe also web components. Alternative specifications. So we have the Unity component specification. And then also the alternatives to the DOM. So we have the Douglas Crockford's helper app, emulators, app browsers. So these things are basically, just take a look on YouTube if you're interested. And new languages as well. So for instance, Reason. We do the Reason ML meetup. And the takeaways are basically that. So standards move slowly. So React also embraces the sound standards. So not all standards, but subset of them. We need a better model than the DOM because the DOM is imperative. You have to load everything into your head. You have to know the whole state of your program. It would be nicer to have like a declarative model. To lower the paradigms into the language maybe helps, so that some of these functional paradigms and things like this. New low-level APIs enable alternative approaches and also like the DOM, so that the future, the alternatives to the DOM and things like this may offer us a way out in the future. Thank you very much.